Hi, I'm Carrie Morton, and welcome back to the university's Teach Out. I'm joined here today by Alex Murphy, and she's an assistant professor at the university's Department of Sociology. So, Alex, why do sociologists get interested in mobility and perhaps the advent of new technology in this space?
Well, actually, a lot of sociologists aren't interested in mobility. But I became interested in mobility because I study poor people and their everyday lives and the challenges that they face and their prospects for upward mobility. And I study them in the context of where they live, so in communities. And for 3.5 years, I lived in a suburb where poverty was rising. Poverty is now, the majority of poor people live in suburbs. And transportation was a huge issue for people.
Right.
And I became, it was sort of obvious a lot of suburbs aren't built for people who can't afford cars. But I was really moved by the profound ways that a lack of transportation impacts people, and so thought, as a sociologist, I need to study this. This is mobility and transportation undergirds everything, whether people get to work and school, if they're integrated into civil society, if they can show up to vote or go, to town halls, if they can access grocery stores. I mean, it's really, it impacts people's social networks if they can see friends and family. So that is why I think sociologists should be attuned to transportation and people's physical mobility. And also because transportation impacts so many facets of our life, it has huge implications for inequality overall, right? Whether you can get somewhere and not take a long time probably matters for the kinds of jobs that you can take or the kinds of, schools you can access. And if you have a hard time getting around, getting out of your house, it's going to have a big impact on whether you can get to the places you need to go, whether you can work, whether you can go to school, take your kids to school, vote, and just be a part of society.
So it sounds like from your work, understanding that transportation is really foundational to our upward mobility as a society.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit, I hear that you have an index that measures this. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So one of the things that my colleagues and I noticed is, so we were both doing research. I was in Pittsburgh and she was in Detroit, and we were just observing all these ways in which transportation was impacting people. And we realized that we were both scholars of poverty, and we realized that there's very few studies that really look at transportation, and that there's really no the measures of transportation in this literature. So there's a whole suite of material hardship measures, and people look at housing insecurity, and they look at whether you can pay your bills and electricity and heat. There's a food insecurity measure, but there's no measurement for whether people can get around as needed. And so we got interested in this and started looking at, well, how do people measure how well people get around? And it turns out there's sort of two ways. One is people often, in the social sciences, people use survey measures. They use a single question that asks, do you have a car? Yes or no. But
that must mean that you have transportation solutions, right?
Exactly.
And if you don't,
exactly.
you don't.
Exactly. So what we know is that, people who are low income can have 5 cars, and none of them may work at any one time. They can't pay for gas or repairs, or they don't have insurance at the moment. We also know that low income people often double up. So you might have 5 adults in the house and 1 car. So one person might be able to get around, but the other 4 adults can't, right? And there's many ways in which this measure is just missing the experience of low-income people. A second way that people measure how people get around as needed is urban planners tend to use accessibility scores, and they look at the neighborhood, whether the neighborhood has access to public transit, and so they score neighborhoods, not individuals, on transportation. So that's a very useful way of thinking about transportation, but it misses the variation that occurs in neighborhoods. So one of the things we were observing is neighborhoods in Chicago, for example, where there's access to a bus line and a train line. So, people we interviewed, especially women and women with kids, often didn't take public transportation because they didn't feel safe. Waiting, in the dark, if it was nighttime, a lot of people don't feel like they can take their small children on transportation, even though they have access to bus lines and things like that. And you'll see in neighborhoods, you'll see one person who can get around as needed and one person who can't. And so there's wide variation that you just can't pick up at the neighborhood level. So we thought that there was really a strong need for a new kind of index. And so we were sort of inspired by the food insecurity index. And what's really ingenious about the food insecurity index is that rather than asking people what they eat, did you eat broccoli and salmon, or how many calories did you consume, or did you eat, enough carbs and protein, it asks you the symptoms of food insecurity. So it asks you questions like, in the last 30 days, have you ever had to split a meal because you couldn't afford to eat more? Or in the last 30 days, how often have your cupboards been empty? So these are the kinds of things that people who are food insecure experience. And we loved that as a model because we are never going to be able to catalog. It'd be very hard in any measure to catalog all the kinds of ways that people get around, right? Whether it's walking or taking a bus or taking a car or ride sharing. But what we can do is probably catalog the manifestations of what we're calling transportation insecurity, because no matter how you get around, it usually manifests in similar ways. And so some of the questions that we've come up with, so these are all symptoms of transportation insecurity, and they tap into two dimensions of insecurity. One is a material dimension, and these are the kinds of questions that tap into, do you have to arrive early to a place and wait a long time because your ride could only give you a ride an hour early or something?
Sure.
Do you have to wait a long time to get picked up? Wait time is a huge issue for people who don't have, who are transportation insecure. Material questions ask people about whether they, in the past 30 days, have you felt stuck at home because you didn't have the transportation you needed? Have you had to reschedule an appointment because you didn't have the transportation you needed? Right. These are all the sort of material ways in which transportation insecurity manifests. And then there's a whole relational dimension, and this is really where sociologists, or which I think is uniquely sociological, which is that transportation impacts how people experience their relationships. People use their networks all the time to get around. And so there's a whole set of questions in this index that ask people like, have you felt like people were avoiding you because you didn't have the transportation you needed? Do you feel left out because you don't have the transportation you needed? Do you feel like you're inconveniencing friends, family, neighbors because you don't have the transportation you need? And so the measure captures both these material and relational dimensions to come up with a measurement of how insecure you are.
So it sounds like you've really taken the reverse. Instead of measuring the ways people get around, you're measuring the gaps that are appearing materially and socially in their lives.
Right.
Because of a lack of transportation in one form or another.
Right.
So do you see any themes popping up in your data in areas that are particularly challenging, either in a specific geographic region or nationally or with a different age population? What trends do you see?
Yeah, so I wish I could answer this better. We have, we're in the second stage of this work, and we just fielded a nationally representative survey. So what's going to be really great is we're going to be able to tell you what the prevalence of insecurity is nationwide, by subgroup, by race, by age, by rural area. So we don't know that exactly. In the first wave of the survey that we were doing to develop the index, we definitely saw insecurity was high among people who live in rural areas, people who are older, and people who are poor and have low resources. So I can tell you that. I can tell you that we were very excited to see that the survey data showed us that that transportation insecurity does in fact manifest in these material and relational ways, because that's what we were observing on the ground in people's everyday lives. And so when you can sort of take an observation and then have it be confirmed by quantitative data, it seems it's much more robust. So that's as much as I can say so far.
So initial findings, and but looking forward, we're sitting here in an automated shuttle. These have the potential to help provide first mile, last mile transportation solutions. In the future, they would be driving around without any conductor. And I think more broadly, these technologies hold the promise for safer, more efficient, and more accessible transportation. And so in what ways could you envision this technology being part of the solution of some of the problems that you've been studying?
Yeah. I mean, if they are, certainly if they're used in the first mile, half mile problem, I think that would be huge for people. I think, the big question is how will they be rolled out, right? And will they be used and distributed in ways that get to neighborhoods that usually are passed over, can we sort of alleviate some of the inequalities we've already created in our transportation system? And I think that it'll be a big question about, how affordable will they be? Can people afford to buy them? Will shuttles will autonomous shuttles be put in low-income neighborhoods? Or will they be equitably distributed across neighborhoods? I think that's a huge question. So I think they hold a lot of potential, but I think there's, only if we really put equity at the core of thinking about how we roll this out, right? And in that it's really, it can't be an afterthought. It has to be really at the center of every decision we make about infrastructure and laws and policies and things like that.
Absolutely. I think now there's a lot of question in the public about trust, and I think trust and equity go together. Understanding how these are rolled out and for the benefit of all of society will be important to help build that trust, in addition to proving they're safe and a reliable method of transportation.
For sure, yeah.
Absolutely. So overall, would you say that in terms of equity, you're excited about the opportunity that AVs might bring, or more cautious?
I'm cautiously optimistic.
Oh, I like that.
I think we have a real opportunity ahead of us, and that's very exciting. But I'm cautious because I also, looking historically, we don't necessarily have a good record on these issues, and I think that also, there's so much excitement around transportation and the new innovations and just getting the technology right. That I think this question has been lagging. And I think there's also been such a push to have things roll out that I worry that, the market will sort of take over, and who can pay for the new and shiny object. And that will already create inequalities. So I think, if we can have this, if we, at all times when we're talking about autonomous vehicles, we can also be thinking about equity, I think we'll be in a good place, but we can't have it as an afterthought. It really has to be at the core of the conversation.
So how do you think that neighborhoods or areas that have established challenges in transportation equity, how do you think that they could impact a rollout that really takes all of society's transportation needs into view? How do you think that folks like you and I could have an impact on that rollout?
I think we could be very vocal with our elected officials and put this on their agenda, that we're watching closely when we're watching what kinds of decisions they're making, and we're watching sort of how they're regulating companies who are rolling this out in the technology. I think we can also be watching what's happening to public transit systems, as this is going out, because we think that autonomous vehicles will impact public transportation systems, and so the first mile, half mile problem, could become a 2 mile. It could be.
We could really challenge our existing transit systems.
Right. And so I think just being on top and not waiting till we start seeing the signs of sort of worsening transportation security, but really letting our elected officials know that we're watching this closely, and that this is something we care about is important. And probably, things like this, educating people about them. I think, it's hard for people to imagine what these changes might mean for their lives. And so I think, having conversations in communities, even elected officials talking to people about, here's what's coming, what do you guys need, what kinds of fears do you have, how do you think this technology would alleviate things, I think could go a long way.
I think it's exciting to think about a future where we're trying to do more and more with less infrastructure spending and less transit spending, to integrate technology in a way that can actually provide a better outcome overall with fewer dollars. So I think making sure that those conversations are ongoing will certainly help in that regard.
Yeah.
So Alex, other than the potential for not focusing on accessibility, what are some specific negative consequences that might happen if we don't put our focus there with the advent of AVs?
So this is a big question, and I think it's to be determined, but I think there's a couple of things we could think about, right? So one is safety. One of the big pushes for AVs is safety. So one question is, if people who have a lot of money and are very wealthy can afford AVs, and people who are low income and don't have that kind of money can't, if AVs improve safety a lot, and people who are wealthy now drive them and aren't at risk of getting in car accidents or, all kinds of things, automobile related injuries, does this mean that low income people now are disproportionately going to be experiencing that, and all the kinds of health issues and mortality issues that come with that. So that could create huge disparities between wealthy people and low-income people just in exposure to transportation-related safety issues. I think another one is, how do we think about AVs and non-AVs on the same roads, right? So if we have car lanes that only allow AVs and car lanes that only allow, regular cars, what does that mean for, time spent in the vehicle, congestion, exposure to safety? If really wealthy people are driving AVs and more low-income people and working class people aren't, does that expose people to different kinds of fines and fees from police? Do we start making, did the police, are there going to be new traffic tickets that have, that will AVs get traffic tickets, or will, these kinds of violations hit people who are driving regular cars and who just and often don't have the money to pay for these kinds of things? I think another big question is just, will cities or regions start saying we want to be a very safe place, so we want only AVs in our streets? And what kinds of implications would that have for patterns of neighborhood or regional segregation just along access to kinds of transportation?
Right.
So I think there's a lot of ways that are hard to even imagine, but could come up that if we don't think about this.
Professor Murphy, thank you so much for starting the conversation with us here about how we can incorporate AVs into an equitable transportation solution for all. And thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue in the discussion forum.